guys, we are going to do a little lesson and talk about pedigrees today. And so this is my pedigree. I made this a very long time ago. So here I am, right here. And you see that I'm represented by a circle. And that's because a circle is going to indicate a female, okay? So here beside me, that would be my sister, okay? So notice my sister and I are separated by a bracket from these two people. Okay, those would be our parents. And then my mom here has two siblings, and this would be their spouses and their children. Notice their children here, these guys, are in the same line with me because each kind of row or line on a periodic table represents a generation. So everybody in this row is going to be my first cousin or their spouse, okay? So this guy is crossed out. That means he's deceased. You could see, well, before I wrote on it, you could see a little X. You see it again here. That person was deceased at the time that I made this pedigree. You don't see my husband here because we weren't married at that time, so he wasn't in the pedigree, or my kids for that matter. This symbol here, can anybody indicate what that is? So this is my uncle, David, all right? And then you see he's got two women, all right? He's not married to both of them at the same time, but this symbol here is indicating divorce. So he was married to Tanya, and they had one child, Andrew. And then he was married to Patty, and they had another child, Christina. And so Andrew and Christina are brother and sister, but by different parents, okay? And that would indicate divorce. All right, so let's look at a couple of other things. This line, and some of these pedigree symbols are pretty sophisticated. I'm not going to ask that you know how to do them all. I'm just kind of pointing them out to see that you can get a lot more detail on a pedigree. Okay, so this line here is indicating engagement. So those two are engaged to be married, but they're not married yet. Okay, or at the time of this pedigree, that's how it was. All right, this here indicates that they had this child, but they were not married, okay? This here is going to indicate that they had a child, they were not married, but that relationship is no longer together, and that's why it's got the crossed out mark, okay? You see little numbers inside the pedigrees. Those indicate ages. This was a digital program, and so, if I went back into it, actually I don't have a subscription anymore, but those ages, I put the birthday in, and so it automatically calculated the ages. So that is a family pedigree. How many generations do you see here? You should say 4 generations, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 generations. Now, pedigrees usually have some type of shading to them, because generally what we use pedigrees for is not just showing a family tree. We use a family tree to show a family tree. And that's really what I did more with mine, because I wasn't tracking any type of genetic trait or whatever. But it's to track some type of genetic trait. So this one is showing a widow's peak. So the ones that are shaded have the widow's peak. The ones that are white don't have the widow's peak. And so you can trace a trait down through specific generations to determine if an individual is going to have that. So you see her widow's peak here, how it kind of comes down to a point. And she doesn't have that. She has a smooth hairline, okay? So in this diagram, or this trait rather, is dominant, okay? So the people that have the widow's peak are all shaded in. They're all big W, or big W, little w. You see the generations that I was speaking of there? And, this is, kind of fun, I guess, to say, to be able to track a widow's peak. But that's really not what pedigrees are used for either. Pedigrees are more often used to track serious genetic diseases. And so if you know that your family line has a history of cystic fibrosis or has a history of hemophilia or whatever, you can look and say, okay, I know these people do. What is the probability that my kid may also have name the disease? And so that's important for some parents as they try to plan to have children or not to have children, etc. Okay? So you try this one, okay? Pause me, and I want you to try this pedigree. I'm going to work on it as well, and then you can check with me. So your pedigree should look something like this. Now, you may have it flip-flopped or mirror imaged where I have Joe's family on the left and Jane's family on the right. Yours may look opposite of that, but you should definitely have the same people shaded and the same connections made, okay? So Joe's dad has dimples, Joe has dimples, Jane has dimples, and Jane's mom has dimples. Nobody else has dimples. And so they want to, and they're just trying to show that trait here. So can you look at this pedigree and tell if this is a dominant trait or a recessive trait? You should say that dimples is a dominant trait, okay? If dimples were a recessive trait, let's say it were a recessive trait, that means Jane would have to be little d, and Joe would have to be little d. That would also mean that both of them would have to give a little d to Clarissa and make her little d, in which case she would also have dimples. But our story tells us that she doesn't, okay? So it can't be a recessive trait. Also, generally, recessive traits you don't see in every generation. Now you may see, well, we don't see this one in every generation either because Clarissa doesn't have dimples, but it's hard to say that she's every generation because there's only one person there so far. So we would need to see a few more people in that generation to be able to say, well, whatever. But because we see this in pretty much every generation, then we're going to say it's most likely a dominant trait. Okay? Also, one other thing, when you do your case study today that's important to know is generally you do things by age. You do pedigrees by age. So the first child that's listed left to right, Jane would be the oldest, Jorge would be the next, and Emily would be the youngest. Okay? Now sometimes it's hard to achieve that because of the way that you're making family connections, but that is typically the way that it's supposed to be done. Oldest on the left, youngest on the right. Okay? I did that in my pedigree here. I was the oldest, my sister was the youngest. My mom was the oldest, then the next, then the next. Now, it didn't work out that well for my dad. He's the oldest, but he's kind of drawn in here as the youngest just because I needed to have him like on the outside to meet up with my mom. So it doesn't work every time, but if you can, try to draw the oldest on the left to the youngest on the right. Okay? So one other thing that I want to say about genetic traits is that just because it is dominant doesn't mean it has to be dominant in the population. Okay? So for example, in this case, we just identified dimples as dominant. Well, you and I both know that dimples in the population is not a dominant trait. You may have noticed in one of the problems that you were working last week that I think it was achondroplasia. Maybe you didn't read that one yet. I feel like there was an example. But achondroplasia, which is dwarfism, is a dominant trait. And it is not dominant in the population. Just because it's a dominant trait or a dominant disorder doesn't mean it's dominant in the population. Okay? Dwarfs are not the norm, right? They're not the most common. The same is true for polydactyly. Polydactyly means having, more than 5 fingers on your hands or toes. That is a dominant trait. It is not dominant in the population. Okay? So let's look at recessive disorders. So recessive disorders, such as albinism, show up when you have two recessive traits, okay? Those heterozygotes that we have talked about are the carriers, meaning they can carry that gene or pass it on to their offspring. Dominant disorders, okay? So dwarfism, as I just mentioned, or chondroplasia is the technical name for that, is a dominant disorder. Now, so for this trait, if you're big D, little d, or big D, you would be a dwarf. Normal would be the homozygous recessive, little d, okay? And so in genetics, we have a lot of opportunity to test for these things, to be able to identify carriers. There's a lot of fetal testing that can be done. And so when, individuals start a family or become pregnant, at every routine doctor's office, they're going to ask you if you want to do any type of fetal testing to test for certain genetic disorders. Some things can be identified through basic ultrasound, but there's also higher tech ultrasounds, nuchal translucency screenings, which is a specific type of ultrasound that you can see genetic traits on. Some things have characteristic appearances, like a normal thing, they always, in an ultrasound, they measure the heart. They look at the heart. They look to see that the heart's been formed right. That's really important. They measure the thickness of the back of the baby's neck using technology on the computer and in the ultrasound, and that can help determine if they had something like Down syndrome. And so a regular routine ultrasound is one form of fetal testing, but there's other alternatives as well. You can do an amniocentesis or a chronic villus sampling. And so both of these are a little bit more invasive. They do pose a little bit of a risk to the baby, because basically they stick a needle in the mama's belly and they're trying to sample the placenta or sample something inside, and take a sample and be able to test for genetic diseases or genetic irregularities that way. In Kentucky, all babies undergo a newborn screening. So before you can leave the hospital with your baby, they do a heel prick and they send off and test for like 20 different genetic diseases, because they need to be able to identify certain of those things early and help the baby get treatment, and things that you may not know physically or that might not show up in routine daily exams and normal things for the first several weeks or months or maybe even years of life. And so newborn screening helps to identify some of those things as well. And so those are questions that new parents always face as they enter into starting a family. Okay? So today you are going to work on a Blue People case study. So the Blue People, I'm not sure if you've heard of them before, but they are the Fugate family. And they are from the Pikeville area of the state in eastern Kentucky. They lived in the 1800s, and there is a gene that is responsible for a disorder with the hemoglobin, which is found in the blood. And so those who inherited this copy of the gene, then they had bluish skin, as you can see in this picture. This picture is not photoshopped. It's from a long time ago, but they truly have bluish skin. But many of them also have normal skin. And so you are going to go through and you're going to construct this pedigree. It's going to be pretty big. You'll want to do it on, the back of your paper, on a sheet of notebook paper, and making sure to make those relationships correctly. Okay. Sometimes I will say in a pedigree, some people will draw a carrier. If you're a carrier or a heterozygote, they will shade them halfway. And so if you want to do your pedigree today and shade it halfway to indicate a carrier, that would mean that they don't have the disease, but they carry the disease if it were a recessive disorder. Okay, so if you have any questions on that, let me know. You're also going to be asked if it's a recessive trait or a dominant trait, and so make sure to answer those questions as well. You all have a great day.